Hi, Randi. Hi, Grace.
And we got into a conversation one day about Christianity and paganism. And we decided to share some of it with you.
Yay!
And we should probably say something about why we got into this conversation, although you might be able to guess.
How did you get into this conversation in the first place?
Well, Grace has been offering us from her Norse pagan community here in Albuquerque some opportunities for the people in this church to participate in rituals that are important to that community. And years ago, I used to be part of a feminist spirituality group in which we did some similar kinds of things. And I'm a Christian, so the question always was in my mind, why in this modern world do we have to, as Christians, do we have to be looking to a pagan renewal, a resurrection of pagan traditions in order to satisfy something deep inside that seems to be missing from, I would argue, missing from modern Christianity. But I don't know if that's how Grace got into this conversation.
Grace, how did we?
I've been trying to figure out how that all happened. But, I think one place to start for me is I love to look up the definitions of words. And the definition of communion is the sharing or exchange of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially on a mental and spiritual level. And that's what brought me to this church, is having a desire to have a spiritual communion with people. And, thanks to TikTok and Pastor Sarah, I figured that this was a place I could do that. And, this is one of those moments where we can have those shared thoughts and ideas and just kind of think about where we can come together as spiritual and religious people.
I think we're on the same wavelength there. So what would you like to talk about first?
I'm not sure. We can edit that part out, right?
We can edit as much as we want.
So
More edits are more work. However,
Yes.
I'm already thinking about, it might be nice, because this is such a wide angle shot, it might be nice for me to zoom in as each of you are talking.
okay.
Every now and then. But then also I can do, the interaction between you is really cool. But I think if we just talk to each other, you know what I mean? If you just talk to each other,
I think we'll be fine.
you're going to be fine. And you don't
You know
have to look right at the camera. You could just...
Let's start with the ceremony you want to do next Sunday in the afternoon after church.
Or this Sunday in the afternoon after
This
church.
Sunday.
Yes.
And let's just start there.
Okay.
Because it's about the ancestors.
Yes. And I know we talked something about ancestors before.
We did.
Yes.
And so there are some differences, I think, between Christian understanding of ancestors and Norse understanding of ancestors. And we live and are having this conversation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And there's a whole bunch of other traditions that have a completely different understanding of ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
But there's some underlying connections. So why don't we talk about ancestors for a minute?
All right. Sorry, I'm so nervous.
It's okay.
Okay, so, if you just want to ignore the cameras, just talk to me, Randi,
Yeah.
Yeah.
because I'm very curious.
Yes.
Tell us about what the Norse believe about ancestors.
First off, ancestors aren't necessarily our ancestors of blood. They're, it's very common to have adoptions within the Old Norse community. And so, whenever I talk about ancestors, I often say, beloved dead of blood and bond. So it's not just those people. And when we honor our ancestors, it's not to worship them, and it's not to say that, everything that they did in life was good. We recognize that we have ancestors who did some very bad things, and we recognize that it is our job to try to be better than them, and that is the legacy, is to be better than our ancestors were. And we can look at our spiritual practices the same way. The Norse back in 900 may have been doing things that today we recognize as morally not so great, and so again with that, we work on being better.
Yeah, I think for me that raises a 2-level thing, because I have Norse ancestors from my mother's Norwegian family, and I know that some of them were Laplanders from far north in Norway, and those are Arctic people, and some of them were from the more southern part of Norway and had a lot, those were the ones who in 900 were raiding and burning down things and stealing stuff, and, like Hagar the Horrible
Yes.
in the comic
Yes.
strips. And then I'm a Christian, and for Christianity, ancestors, the communion of saints are our ancestors. All of these people who have been in communion with each other. And I think there are Christians who would restrict that communion of saints to only the truly converted and baptized, and even possibly only the saintly people. But I tend to think it's the communion of everybody who has tried to follow the way of Jesus. And that's a messy kind of thing to do. So I'm hoping to feel at home among my ancestors when I join them. That they didn't figure it all out, and they did the best they could.
Right.
And given their own understandings, and that somehow that communion allows us to, being in communion with them allows us access to some wisdom
Yes.
that we wouldn't otherwise have.
Yes. And, within ADF ceremony, one of the rituals that we do is we consider water to represent the ancestors, the well, the deep. And sometimes we speak of drinking from the well of wisdom and sharing in the wisdom of those ancestors. And that's something I often do within ritual, is we ceremonially have a drink and ask for the wisdom of the ancients, ask for the wisdom of the well.
I like that image.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of my passion for history. And these words, as you were talking about the origins of words, the word history has a deep history back in Greek language and culture. And in its original forms, the old words that make up that word in Greek and then in English, the main meaning is to visit.
Mm.
And it's not just any old visit. There's all kinds of different kind of ways of visiting, but this is a visit with the purpose of getting to know somebody. And so the study of history is visiting our ancestors with the purpose of getting to know them. So for me, the engagement of, studying history is a spirituality that goes back way further than Christianity. And there's this getting to know. And it seems to me that getting to know 9th century Norse people, because that's just about the time the Norse people were beginning to be interested in Christianity. Getting to know why they made a switch in religion, or why they translated their tradition into Christian terms,
Mm-hmm.
or exactly how they did that. I know that it took a long time.
Yeah.
And I think it means there isn't a clear division that this is Christian and this is everything else, the way we tend to think about it.
Yes. And there's an interesting blending in Iceland. So a lot of the sagas we have come from Iceland, and they were one of the last places to be converted due to their isolation. And part of the reason they converted was, the mainland people, they wanted to keep their relations good with them. So conversion was kind of a political thing, but, it was accepted. And so you still have this blending of things. And from what I have heard, there's still a lot of the old beliefs in Iceland, like they believe in trolls and things like that still, for them, exist. It's not a mythology, it's just part of the landscape, yet it's a primarily Christian country.
Right. And I remember reading in graduate school a translation of an old letter when the people from Iceland colonized Greenland. Well, I don't know if colonized is the right word. They had a little settlement there. That's not quite the same as a colony. And this is back in the day when you could grow crops in Greenland. Now, we may be able to do that again pretty soon, but you could do that in the 9th century. You could grow crops in Greenland. But you couldn't grow wheat or grapes. And the priests in Iceland wrote a letter to the Pope asking, can we use barley bread and beer for the Eucharist? And the Pope wrote back and said, absolutely not. You have to use wheat bread and wine, which meant they could only celebrate the Eucharist when the supply ship came in. And to me, that's a failure of translation.
Yeah.
And it signals this, what we think of in this pagan Christian split, the difference between the person with power who bases everything on a written text, that is the authority. And the people for whom religion is a practice and a much more intimate engagement of spirit with their daily life.
Yes.
And I think that's part of what gets in the way of pagan Christian dialogue and acceptance of each other is this Christian reliance on a written text as an authority.
Yes.
But there are some written texts in Norse pagan terms, which is why modern people can get access.
Right. And
To
for
that
us,
tradition.
we don't think of the sagas as our holy book. There's
Yeah.
something that we can kind of pull from and look at the myths and, that particular time period, but they're not considered our holy books that we have to rotely sort of follow for practice. And, there's, for us, we have a broken line of practice. And so it really is trying to recreate a practice with limited resources and resources that were written down after Christianization, so they have that influence. And so I think for us it allows us to more critically think about the texts without the threat of heresy, and it creates more of an opportunity for people to take what they need from it. Whereas, thinking about myself growing up in a, Redeemer Lutheran Missouri Synod church, it was this way and the pastor said this and this is the way it goes and there's no arguing with it. This is the law, this is the word, and there's no allowance for other interpretation. And fortunately, I've learned that there are Christians who don't have that narrow sort of rigid belief system. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people to paganism from Christianity, is they've been in those very rigid sort of churches and it didn't work for them. And this, paganism allows for taking what you need from it and, the flexibility of belief systems.
I know quite a few Christians who would be kind of alarmed at the conversation we're having. Because for them, there is an authority. And that authority settles things. And that authority provides the basis for, if you're going to commit your life to something, and it's a life and death kind of commitment, in terms of the afterlife, if you will, it's a heaven or hell commitment.
Right.
I can deeply understand the need for clarity if you have that fear. And they would argue, I think they would argue, that you should have that fear. Because the authority says things that, if you ignore that, you ignore that at your peril. I think, as I read those Christian texts, there's something similar in them and in other religious texts. There is a spirit. There's a struggle to understand a spiritual reality and try to put it into words. And the spiritual reality can be experienced physically, but it's a kind of an underlying truth or an underlying way. I got that from Chinese. The way. that if you try to harmonize your life with that way, not only does your life go more smoothly, but you'll see the well. You'll run into it, you'll find it. If you don't harmonize with the way, you'll never find the well that you're talking about earlier. It will always be hidden off to the side. And with Christianity, Christians early on called it the way. And I think that's what Jesus was getting at. If you live this way, you will find the well of salvation, shall we say, or the well that makes you whole, that heals you, that puts you in communion with other people. If you don't follow the way, you're not going to find the well. And it was, I think, a mistake Christianity made when it started interpreting the way as the law.
Mm.
But I don't know if that happens in paganism as you know it.
It certainly does happen. I think there are certainly those groups who try to bring the law into it, and those are usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, often the groups that I am aware of who go that direction are also the ones who are very exclusive. You have to look a certain way, you have to ascribe to a certain gender role, sexuality. I see that more in those types of groups than in general in paganism. Again, my personal experience, what I know of people. I think that...
I have a thing to ask in a second. Go ahead.
I have no idea what I was saying. So.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay. That's okay.
So there are faiths that follow a law. For example, Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And people find it incredibly fulfilling and meaningful and a way to connect to their faith. How did Christians depart from that? I'm wondering. Because I feel like that the way that my Orthodox Jewish friends interpret the law and experience the law and relate to the law is very different than sort of the legalistic Christian literal interpretation of Scripture.
I think you find the dilemma embedded in the Christian texts, because the struggle of Jesus was not that he wasn't Jewish. His struggle was with what does it mean to fulfill the law? And I think in Judaism, as I understand it from rabbis I've known and also Jewish scholars, is that the law can be a way, or the law can be I'm not quite sure how to put it. But if you're only fulfilling the law to check off boxes and fulfill the law, you haven't really understood the way.
Mm.
If you follow the law as the way to God, then you find this well that gives you life. And I think that may have been what Jesus meant when he both said the law binds people, but also said you have to keep every single bit of it. And And my understanding of what happened to Judaism and Christianity after the temple was destroyed is this tension about what the law is, and the spirituality of the law was the foremost thing that the early Christians and that the Jewish communities of that time had to struggle with.
Oh.
And I don't think
So-
Christians are any better at discerning when the law is freedom and when the law is a chain.
So I'm curious from both of you, because we have somebody being baptized on Sunday, and part of baptism is bringing someone into community. What is the role of the broader Norse community and the broader Christian community in helping with things like discernment, helping you stay on your path, supporting you? And maybe, and are the ancestors included in part of that?
I'll need to think about that for a minute,
Okay.
so.
Well, I think one thing that happens in Christian baptism is a person joins the communion of saints. You don't have to die first. But baptism is also somewhat symbolic of a death of one kind of way of being and the birth of another kind of way of being that is a larger communal way of being. Now, I wouldn't think a child would understand that. But if we wait to baptize people until they really understand it, we wouldn't baptize anybody, hardly.
Because who among us really understands baptism, right?
We understand baptism by living the way, and if we're in a community that supports us in that effort, we'll be fine. If we're in a community that fundamentally somehow misunderstands both the teaching of Jesus and the deeper roots of the tradition from which Jesus comes, it doesn't matter if they're baptized.
So what about in paganism?
I'm trying to think of an equivalency for us.
It doesn't have to be baptism, but what's the role of community in support? Like, can you be a pagan alone?
Yes. But I think a lot of us still seek community. And I belong to a couple of organizations, and there's a lot of solo practitioners, yet they still find community in at least, belonging to this greater organization. And for some of us, we really crave that sense of community and connection. For some people, they don't need it or don't want it, or, for them it's icky. But yes, you can be a solo practitioner, and I think for modern practitioners a lot these days, the primary connection is to Mother Earth or to nature. And then community might be secondary to that. So they might have a spiritual community, or they might have some other sense of community, but that primary connection spiritually for them is to nature.
Or what about a connection? Is there a sense of a connection to a deity or multiple deities, or to the ancestors themselves? Is that part of the sense of, like, guidance?
For some people, and thinking about deities specifically, there are a lot of people who call themselves pagan who are what we would think of as atheists. They don't believe in any deity, and again, that primary connection is to Mother Earth. For some of those people, they might like the gods in a sense of having a something to kind of live up to, an archetype kind of thing. And for a lot of people, that connection to ancestors is very important as well. But again, Mother Earth, would say, is the primary. And for some people, it's the, not knowing where they came from, if they're adopted or coming from a very dysfunctional family, they may not want to connect to ancestors. But for some of those people, their family of choice becomes ancestors for them.
There is a somewhat connected way that Christians, in the roots of Christianity, Christianity, I think, is less focused on Mother Earth and less focused on nature, because Christianity was basically an urban religion. But Christians did read the philosophers, the Greeks, for instance, like Plato, for whom the deity was the good, with a capital G. And Plato didn't specifically locate the good in creation the way the Jewish philosophers do. And so Christianity was able to draw from the good as a kind of virtue, or maybe a virtue, a communal virtue. And they were able also to draw on the sense of human beings as part of this larger creation. And so in Christianity, there's some tension. There's some tension there, but I think Christianity lacks a strong sense of connection to nature.
Mm-hmm.
I do think Christians have some solo practitioners. Hermits, for instance. There were a lot of hermits early on. People who would go out into the desert and pray and struggle with the devil, and I think they felt connected to community in the sense of the communion of saints more than community in the sense of a specific group of people to whom they were known. So we don't have as many hermits these days. Christian hermits.
Yes.
But it's interesting you mentioned the connection to the earth is something missing in Christianity, because so many of our members connect to God in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a little study one time of UCC spirituality, and Jonathan Edwards had that same sense. His fundamental religious conversion experience was in a grove of trees.
Mm.
But one of the interesting things about modern UCC Christians is their connection to nature was sort of like this. The awesome beauty, the intricate design of nature that allows for things like evolution, and the way in which human beings can participate in the fertility of the earth and things like that. But they didn't want to be out in a rainstorm. They didn't want to be cold. They didn't want to be hot. They didn't want to be isolated. And so there was a limit to their engagement. And so I began to wonder if for many people this nature spirituality was an aesthetic rather than a...
Yeah. I mean, the prayers and blessings and I'm probably going to cut out my talking, just so you know. I may add in a little bit later, or I'll insert myself in between you from behind, just so you know. I'll be a green screen. I will pop out of the green screen. Hello!
I love it.
A lot, because I'm very interested in nature spirituality. A lot of the Christian mystics who went that direction came out of the Celtic tradition, and they had connections to Celtic pagan spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Or they come out of if they're in China, they come out of the Taoist tradition, or if they're in Alaska, they come out of the Alaskan Arctic spirituality that I think finds its way into Norse paganism at certain moments.
Probably. There's a lot of...
Because the dependence on nature is a sort of universal human thing.
Yes.
It's one of the few things that I think it's hard to talk about the nature of being a human being without this necessity of relying on the rest of nature.
Yeah. And, it makes me think about, I've been having some conversations with a friend of mine who's a Slavic practitioner, and she researches a lot of history. And for the Slavs, they were Catholic, and so a lot of their folk traditions got blended into the Catholicism, and particularly in rural areas where you're dependent on nature, you're dependent on knowing the cycles, the seasons, because that is part of your survival. And so the traditions were able to survive within the Catholicism because of that blending and because of the need to remain connected to Mother Earth so she could continue to share her abundance with the practitioners. And, it's interesting for her to hear her talk about how so many things are, it's the Mother Mary of XYZ, it's the Mother Mary of, this thing. So it's very deeply embedded, those two things.
I feel like we have a series that could go much longer.
Oh,
and
yes.
I think, we could do
in 20 minutes,
25 or
it's gonna be
30
really hard
of these.
Yeah, in 20 minutes it's going to be hard for me to select what to put together, but I just want to say, I feel like I've learned so much about where there are commonalities, where there are differences, and also where Christianity and paganism have really informed each other, and also how we could continue to learn from each other. So thank you for doing this. Do you have any final thoughts?
Would it be helpful for me to kind of define Druidry, heathenism, paganism?
Yeah, sure. So, Grace, how would you define, since so many of us are Christian in the room, heathenry and paganry and Druidry? Did I say that right?
Close. That's
Okay.
pretty good. So with Druidism, you know what? I love my definition. So this comes from Wikipedia, and I think it really, oh shoot, did I write it down, or is it on my phone? Hold that thought.
Okay.
I took a screenshot.
Is it Druid? How do you say
You
that?
can say Druidism or Druidry.
Druidism. That's much easier. Druidry, I cannot
Druidry.
say. Druidism.
All right. There we go. I know I took a screenshot.
Because I went to the Pagan Pride event, and there were a lot of people calling themselves heathens or druids or just pagans. And I am
Yes.
very interested, what is the difference? And do you identify as a druid, but also a pagan?
I do.
Okay. Do you also identify as a heathen?
Yes. Oh my goodness, earlier here it is. Yes. All right. So with Druidry, one thing to keep in mind is that traditional Druids passed down their lore orally. And so when they were wiped out, we lost the lore. So we don't know a lot about their practices. We've got bits and pieces. So modern Druidry doesn't necessarily reflect ancient Druidry. So Wikipedia has a pretty nice definition. Druidry, sometimes termed Druidism, is a modern spiritual or religious movement that promotes the cultivation of honorable relationships with the physical landscapes, flora, fauna, and diverse peoples of the world, as well as with nature deities and spirits of nature and place. Theological beliefs among modern Druids are diverse, however, all modern Druids venerate the divine essence of nature. So thinking about ADF, which was one of the groups I was part of, you're allowed to follow any Indo-European gods, pantheons within that. So it's very broad, but the focus is kind of on nature. And when we think of paganism, I would say it's very similar, but opens up beyond Indo-European. And even within that, there's going to be a lot of definitions. And the reality is most paganism is neo-paganism. Very few paths are going to be unbroken, where we've had a common practice that continues. Most of us are trying to recreate as opposed to resurrect, because we don't have enough information to resurrect what was there.
So in Christianity, paganism is a term for everyone who is not Christian.
Yes.
Generally, right? We have Judaism, Muslim, and then everyone else is pagan. So, for example, when I lived in Japan, Shintoism was more animistic, very connected to the natural world. Would pagans say they're part of our tradition?
I would say at some point we did, but the Shinto people would not say they are pagans, and so we have to respect that. So it's...
Or like Native American folks in the United States.
Yeah, I think most of them are offended if we refer to them as pagans, because we're out here trying to recreate something else. And
the way those words have been used is different for the current day resurrection of traditions vis-a-vis the way in which missionaries use them. So pagan was a Latin word meaning the people of the countryside.
right.
And since Christianity was an urban religion, they distinguished themselves from the unconverted pagans. And then there began to be a kind of a paganism with a small p and a paganism with a capital P. And the capital P was the kind of cultural, intellectual pagan tradition of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and all those philosophers of the Greco-Roman world whose thought was highly respected by many people, including Christian thinkers, but who were definitely not Christian. And they might have been atheist or agnostic or skeptical about the personified deities like Zeus and so forth. But heathen was just the English word meaning pagan. It
What
was
is
the
it?
people of the heath.
So for us, heathen is kind of a reclaimed word, and
Yeah,
it refers
I think
to.
that's what's going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those of us who practice Norse and Germanic paganism, refer to ourselves as heathens, and there's a number of different terms, asatru, and other terms that I can't think of at the moment. But yeah, so for us, it's a reclamation, and I would say by and large, people who use the term heathenry are trying to separate themselves from people practicing the Germanic type paganism who are kind of leaning toward the alt-right, because that is a big issue within paganism that we are facing and that we have to be very vocal about.
That is something Christians share in common
Yes.
with pagans.
Yeah. And I think also it points out something. I think people should leave with an understanding that there are multiple forms of all of these traditions, and they are not all like each other. So, Russian Orthodox Christianity in Alaska and Congregationalism in Samoa and the African independent churches and the United Church of Christ and the Roman Catholics in Europe, those are very different expressions of Christianity. And sometimes there's a difficulty among us Christians recognizing each other as Christians. And I think it's the same with the multiple pagan traditions. And you mentioned the Native Americans. There are multiple religions there too. It's not like there's a thing called Native American religion. Each people has its own religion, and some of those people have adopted Christianity in one form or another. It doesn't necessarily mean that they adopted Christianity exclusively. So Christianity is not necessarily exclusive, but often is. I don't know if Norse paganism is, you mentioned that some traditions of it are very exclusive.
Right.
And others are not.
Yeah, and, again, looking at heathenry and, let me go back. Sorry, I've got too many thoughts in my head at once. There is a number of us within heathenry specifically who are very vocal and are denouncing the alt-right type of way of practice. Our practice is very inclusionary. Sorry, I'm having a brain moment.
Hey, deep breath.
That's okay.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is there's diversity.
There
within
is
pagan.
diversity. Yes, there absolutely is. Let me go back to, there was
And we've
too
got to
many
wrap up
things.
because we're
Yes.
out of time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a quick thought. For Christians with all of that diversity, at the core, you've got God and Jesus. For pagans, at the core, again, as we discussed earlier, it's veneration of nature, specifically Mother Earth. That's the thing that connects us all. So there might be other pantheons, other ways of practicing, but at the core, we've got Mother Earth. So those are our connections. But yes, there's so much diversity in how and who people worship. Yeah.
Do you have any final thoughts? I don't know that all of this is going to make it.
Yeah,
in.
there's too
course
much.
not.
There's way too much.
I think we just say, we may have to talk again.
Yes. And the question, we kind of got off track, but yes, I identify as a druid, and I also identify as a heathen, which is part of paganism. And I'm not exclusively heathen within my beliefs. There are other gods that, from other pantheons, that I also follow.
I'm sorry, that's my phone.
Speaking of Randi the Christian,
Other Harry Potter.
progressive Christian, has a Harry Potter.
I love it.
Anyway, you know about. Anyway, another time we'll talk about J.K. Rowling. Anyway,
Yes.
Well, there's
so much there.
Yes.
I like that little tune.
I love that little tune. I was just saying, we left our cat with Mrs. McGonagall down the street in Rhode Island. Anyway, speaking of side thoughts. But Randi, do you want to tell us how you identify? Because Grace told us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I identify as Christian. In my time with the Sister Circle group in Claremont, the feminist spirituality group, I came to deeply appreciate the impetus for some to leave Christianity and to foster a different kind of spirituality and a connection with nature. I chose in part because of my relationships with people in the church, certain saints who had shaped my life and my understanding. I chose to remain Christian and not to try to pursue both paths. But I've been committed to understanding what Christianity forgets about its own tradition and its own roots. And how there is in Christianity, there are ways of connecting to nature and seeing it as Augustine and Jonathan Edwards would say, God's other book. So that was my choice.
This is very cool.
Nice. And unlike Dr. Randi, I am no authority on paganism or heathenry.
I'm not either. I'm only an authority on the Christian ancestors.
I'm not even that. I just happen to be a God's person who fills the role. So
Yeah.
I am not authority. Don't take anything I say too seriously.
But we can learn a lot from one another in conversation, which is why I like hanging out with you.
Yes, it has been wonderful having these conversations. Thank you, Randi.
Thank you.
And thank you, Pastor
both.
Sarah,
Yeah.
for making this happen.
Yeah.
We were talking about solitary practice, but we each felt like we had failed to say something about that.
Yes, and I focused too much on that and not enough on
So what else
connection.
is there about
Shit.
solitary practice?
For me, I think I've said plenty about that. I think I missed the mark with talking more about community.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I kind of got off the rails. Are you recording? Oh,
Yeah,
shit.
that's
Sorry.
all right. She can edit.
Yes,
Forget.
I'm sorry. I'm
It's
trying
Turn it
to
out.
edit
it's the 60 seconds that mean something. But what was coming to my mind about the solitary practice that I didn't say was that even if a person is a hermit alone, and I think this would be true whether they're Christian or whether they're some other religion, it seems like all religions have these hermits. Even if they are alone and they're not with other human beings, it's not like they're not in community. They're in community with God or they're in community with nature, and they almost always have communal support. They're able to be alone because there's a community that sustains them.
Mm.
They're not isolated from a group of people, even if they don't see anybody for years and years and years. So, and then we were going to talk about, well, Samhain and All Saints.
Yes, but we need to go back to the
We need to go
group.
back to the hermit.
Yes, or the not hermits in our case. Earlier I was focusing a lot on solitary practice, but I think within pagan community there really is a need for a lot of people to find community. In a lot of places that's not possible, or it's very dangerous. And this conversation was started with the baptism piece and how that brings people into community. And I think for us as pagans, we're still trying to figure out those rituals that are welcoming into the community, really acknowledging that connection to the spiritual community. So my hope is as we continue to progress that we figure out what those rituals are, whether it's naming ceremonies or croning ceremonies or whatever it is, that people can really feel connected. And, we have a lot of online organizations that help us connect, but that person-to-person connection is a little bit harder. And with us, it's not a every Sunday sort of thing. It's, the 8 high days, and I think that contributes to feeling some disconnection for a lot of us as well. So, again, for me personally, that's another reason that I came to this church, so I could have that regular connection here. And, this is my personal experience and what I've observed. You talk to another pagan, they may have very different views and experiences of things.
Same with talking to another Christian. It's a very diverse tradition.
Yes. But then we got started on all of this. We've been talking for a while, but we decided to do this today for Samhain, as that is coming up, which is the Celtic celebration of the ancestors. And throughout Europe, there's different names, but they're all very similar. In Poland, you have Grandfather's Eve. The Norse have Disabloat. So there's all these different pantheons that recognize that there's this liminal space as we move into winter, that space in between where the veil has thinned and the ancestors can come to visit us. So this is a time where we honor them and set out food for them and remember the stories of them. So in speaking their name, they remain with us. They have their immortality through living through us as well as us honoring them on that day.
And the Christian traditions are really, they're really diverse, but they include some of this eating with people. I mean, in the catacombs or in the African cemeteries, Christians would go to the grave of a martyr and eat and drink, understanding that person was there. And I looked and looked and looked for the history of the beginning of the All Saints as a holiday. There's not very much information about it. The earliest written notice of a day called, it was the festival of Saint Mary and all the saints, or Saint Mary and all the martyrs, I can't remember. It was a pope in the 7th century, excuse me, not the 7th century, the 8th century, in the 700s, who, in the process of taking the abandoned Pantheon temple in Rome and making it into a Christian church, initiated this celebration of Mary and all the saints. And different celebrations of all the martyrs had been celebrated in different parts of Christianity, lots of times in connection to Pentecost or Easter rather than in late fall. And what I think happened was that people had been, at least in European Christianity, I don't know how this worked out in, say, Chinese Christianity in the 8th century, but in European Christianity, people had been having these celebrations and connections with their ancestors for centuries and centuries, and they just didn't stop.
Mm-hmm.
And little by little, that practice came to have a Christian character and a Christian meaning. It was reinterpreted, it was retranslated into a different religious form. And so what we do on those days is really quite similar. I'm looking forward to attending this ritual next Sunday.
I'm looking forward to having you.
We're good.
See you
All
then.
right. Yeah.
That was better than